Hi, it's Terry Riddoch from the Property Investment Channel. The best piece of advice I give new landlords is hire a paralegal. They'll keep you out of trouble, they'll answer your questions. Luckily for you, I've got one here with me right now. Stay tuned. Okay, Beta, new landlords or even old landlords, what are the things that get them in trouble the most that you see as a paralegal? What's the number one, number two things? Do not do this, landlord.
Well, the number one thing is when they act on emotion. They act on emotion and they just serve a notice, especially an N12 notice.
Okay,
Uh,
which one? Sorry to interrupt. For
the,
for our viewer, the N12 is
the N12 notice is for the landlord or new purchaser's own use.
right. Gotcha.
Right? So oftentimes, Terry, the landlord will have a conversation with the tenant, and then they'll say, "My expenses are going up. I need a little bit more in rent." The tenant who's often a little bit savvier nowadays, will say, "Well, you have to serve me with the appropriate rent increase notice." The landlord gets upset, and then they serve the N12, and they say, "My child is moving in," or "I'm moving in." And
Right.
of course, they don't know the rules. They don't know that the tenant can contest that notice. They find out they have to file with the board, and then they have the tenant has all this evidence of the landlord's true intent for an increase in the rent illegally.
Right. And that's again up to $100,000
Yeah.
fine potentially. Um, so what about landlords who are, the rent's always late, but I'm a little bit permissive and forgiving about this. You've got rules about stuff on the outside of the apartment building. They're storing their boat. What's some advice that you would give and ways to enforce leases for tenants, or sorry, for landlords who have been a little bit too permissive over the years?
So I always tell landlords, follow your rules. If it Being a landlord is like having children, right? If you're too lenient, you're teaching them, and I have a 4-year-old, and I'm learning this too. I'm teaching them how to behave with me. I'm teaching them um, how to get away with things,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And if you're lenient on the rent, well, Terry was lenient last month. He'll be lenient again.
Right. Yeah.
Like,
And I
Terry let us park our motorcycle on the front, the grass in the front. It's okay. We don't need to ask him for permission. And
y-
then things get out of hand.
yeah, and I think that's excellent advice, and that's what I tell landlords as well. I mean, you be friendly, but they're not your friends. This is a business relationship, and you have to act and signal accordingly. So, another question for you. What about snow removal, lawn care? In a lot of leases, especially for the landlords that maybe have just one house or maybe they've got a duplex, they're pawning off the they're pawning off. That's the wrong. They're asking the tenants who have agreed to, you guys are responsible for shoveling the sidewalk and you guys are responsible for mowing the lawn. What happens? Talk to me a little bit about some mechanisms to make sure that gets done. And secondly, instances where all of a sudden bylaw comes by because these guys haven't mown the lawn in 4 months, whatever. So, talk to me a little bit about leases.
Let's talk about that. Well, firstly, any term or clause in a lease agreement that is contrary to the act, that's the Residential Tenancies Act, is automatically unenforceable and void. Secondly, even if the tenant agrees to grass cutting and shoveling the snow, the law says, in accordance to Section 20 of the Act, that the landlord is responsible to maintain and repair. And grass cutting and snow removal, well, they fall under maintenance. So it is the landlord's responsibility, even if the parties agree. Now, the only way around that is for a landlord to draft a contractor's agreement totally separate from the lease and pay the tenant for shoveling the snow and cutting the grass. Now, one thing that landlords need to know is that if the tenant says, I'm not doing this anymore, guess what? You're As a landlord, you're going to have to do it yourself, or you're going to have to hire someone to do it.
Okay, so that's what I do with mine is there is the lease and then there's a separate piece of paper with the tenant not in their capacity as a tenant, but in their capacity as you're the guy I'm hiring to do the sidewalks and the lawn, and it's $1 a year, and they sign it. They can just rip that up. Now, the question I've
Pretty.
got for you is bylaw comes by, they haven't informed you that they're not doing this, and you get a fine. You're what are you going to do? Go after the tenant somehow? How
That depends on what's in your contractor's agreement,
right. Okay.
right? But you have to treat that tenant like you would any contractor that you hire. What would you do? You would actually find out or have them provide you with confirmation every time they shovel the snow.
Right. Okay. So what about utilities? If in the lease it's clearly the tenant are responsible for the heat, the hydro, and everything, and they just stop paying, and all of a sudden they get shut off, is the landlord obligated to suck it up and get those services back on?
So that's a great question. Depending on what's in their lease. Now, if the tenant has, let's say, an Enbridge gas account that's fully in their name, they are responsible. The lease says they're responsible, and Enbridge cuts them off. That's on the tenant.
What
But
happens if we're getting closer to winter where now I don't know if they do that. Let's pretend that they do that, where
yeah,
there's some danger of, hey, you won't be able to live in this house because it's too cold. Does a landlord at that point need to
not if it's the tenant is responsible. No.
okay,
One thing that landlords will be responsible for, because often the municipality doesn't put it in the tenant's name, is the water. Right? The
right,
water, if the tenant doesn't pay, will get tacked onto the property taxes.
right,
But the other bills, like the Enbridge bill, will follow the tenant anywhere they go. The landlord
gotcha.
doesn't really need to worry about that because that account number is for the tenant.
For the tenant. Okay.
Yeah.
So talk to me about deposits. What are some things to watch out for with deposits?
Let's talk about illegal deposits.
Mm,
Well, the act says that a landlord can request and hold equivalent to 1 month's rent, a last month's rent deposit. Okay. That deposit is to be applied to the last month of the tenancy. With the exception of a key deposit, any other deposit is illegal, which means it cannot be requested or held by the landlord. Now, sometimes the parties will, and this has been going on lately because of all the crazy bidding wars on rental units. Tenants are paying upfront for the entire year or for the 6 months.
yep.
Now, remember, any term that's in the lease agreement that's contrary to the act is automatically void, even if the parties agree. So what we're finding is that tenants will agree to pay upfront for the year just to secure that unit. And then they'll go to the board, they'll bring an application to request a refund of all those monies.
Okay. So it's not it's like agreeing to work for less than minimum wage. You're not allowed to do it. You can't do it.
Correct.
Correct? Okay.
Correct.
So you're seeing that where I'm going to give you the whole year. And it's not that the tenant is thinking, this way I don't need to worry about it. They're trying to secure the unit and they're immediately turning around to the board. Hey, wait a minute. This guy took a year's deposit. Correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right. So we're watching out for that. And again, just keep your nose clean, follow the rules, and you'll be fine, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so Ontario's standard lease. So right now in Ontario, there's a standard lease. Do I have to use that? Can I just write my own?
Well, you should be using the Ontario Standard Lease. I use the Ontario Standard Lease for my own rental properties. That's all I use. I don't have any schedules. I don't have any appendices. The reason why is because the Ontario Standard Lease contains everything legal that you need to include in your lease. That way, you don't even have to think. Oh, did I forget this clause or did I forget that clause? No, it's already in there.
Okay, yeah, and that makes sense. So final question for you. Looking at a lot of the N forms, they seem rather straightforward. So I've got a question. Why would a landlord hire a paralegal when they can do it themselves? And a lot of them do think they can do it themselves. Tell me tell me what's going on here.
So let's talk about that, Terry. You're right. A lot of the end forms, just by looking at them, They look simple. I mean, pretty straightforward. The box says landlord name, tenant name. You fill in the landlord and tenant name. How hard can that be? Well, here's why you need a paralegal. Number one, many landlords, especially the newer landlords, they don't know what the requirements or consequences are of filling out these legal documents. For example, many landlords don't know that by serving an N12 notice for the landlord's own use, that compensation has to be paid before the termination date, whether or not the tenant moves out. Some landlords think, well, why would I pay compensation if the tenant is still in possession? And they don't pay compensation. And once that matter gets to the board, they haven't fulfilled requirements. So the reason why you need a professional is so that that professional can guide you. And that's any industry. I mean, people buy their own houses. People they self medicate themselves by looking on Google. The reason why you need a professional is that so that they can guide you the right at each and every step the right way in accordance to the law, so that you don't end up waiting 7 to 8 months to get to the board only to find that, hey, landlord Terry, you didn't follow the process. Your matter's going to get dismissed.
Right. And I can give you one example that came across my desk last year. So in a lot of the forms, they'll have the beginning of the tenancy and the beginning of the rental period and the end of the rental period. So somebody had written the period begins June 1st, 2022, I guess, and the end of the period was July 1st, 2000. Well, it's not July 1st. It got pitched,
Yeah.
right? So it's details of paperwork like that. And the other thing is, just in this conversation, or the conversation that we had about tenant turnover. So for the cash for keys, the N11, I didn't realize that it's a good idea, the right thing to do. You're crazy if you don't, to have a separate agreement with that as well. So those are the things I think that even for me, that, I'm pushing 20 years in the business here, where I use a paralegal, right?
Absolutely. You need someone to be in your corner.
Okay, Peter, what are some ways that we can end tenancies in Ontario?
So, Terry, many agents or landlords, they call me and they say, I want to get rid of this tenant for one reason or another. I want to sell my property. I want to move in. The lease is coming to an end. The tenant isn't allowing for showings. How can I get this tenant out? And I always say there's only three ways to end the tenancy. Number one, if the tenant decides to leave and gives notice. Number two, by mutual agreement. Or number three, by way of a court or a board order. So if the parties don't agree or if the tenant doesn't provide notice, the landlord has to pursue a termination of tenancy and an eviction by serving notice, filing the application, proceeding through the lengthy legal process in order to obtain an order to evict. Even when they have an order to evict, now they have to enforce an eviction, which is, another 1 or 2 months.
Mhm.
So
Okay,
those are the only ways that a tenancy can be terminated.
absolutely. Okay, so thanks everybody for watching. Beta, is there anything else that you wanted to add?
I'm always accessible, so if you ever have a question regarding a landlord or tenancy matter, definitely reach out.
Yeah, and your contact information is going to be in the description below. As usual, if anybody has some questions about real estate or you're interested in buying and selling multifamily, I'd love to hear from you. My cell phone and email will be in the description as well. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for watching.